So I think it's important to note as church leaders that the church has been involved in the business of soul care for quite some time. Modern psychology actually is new to the scene, but I think clearly we can benefit from talking with each other. And as one of my professors said, entitled one of his presentations, Shibboleth, can we talk? So it's finding a common language and a way to dialogue with each other, because I think there's lots we can learn from each other. Okay, sorry, I didn't give Al the heads up there. If you can go to Al, one more. There we go. So I think from a psychological perspective, it's kind of an exciting time. There's lots of very cool research going on right now. Research regarding the effectiveness of mindfulness, meditation, and prayer. Researchers have done MRI studies on nuns and to look at, the impact that prayer and meditation has on the brain. And I find it kind of exciting because science is now starting to corroborate what the church has known and practitioners have known for quite some time. So I think it's pretty cool. There's a solid body of research to indicate that persons who are part of a faith community have higher levels of well-being. So there are practitioners in the United States who are very atheistic in their outlook, but they do recommend that their clients go to church. So not because they believe in God, but because they've read the research and they realize that it's good for a person to attend church. Also in terms of the research on the neurobiology of attachment, so BRICE, I thought you might be interested in that one. That's an attachment-based, demonstrating the importance of bonding, and again, taking a neurobiological perspective to this, I think is kind of exciting, and also in terms of resiliency as well, and the benefits of spirituality. Okay. Modern talk therapy actually finds its roots in the practice of the Catholic confession. Talking through problems and other forms of expression can be very therapeutic. I don't know how many people are familiar with the Old Testament story of the rape of Tamar. Did I pronounce that right? Tamar? The advice that this is in the time of King David, and basically she was told in the aftermath of the rape, essentially, be quiet and not to take this to heart. And we don't exactly know what happens to her, but it does make the comment that she remained a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house. So that's probably the effect of not talking through things and not finding a form of expression. Okay. Albert Einstein was quoted as saying, "Religion without science is blind. Science without religion is blind." So mental health professionals and church leaders, I think it's important to recognize that we do in fact have different training and different skill sets. We're not interchangeable parts. But we're both concerned with trying to heal the suffering of the human mind, psyche, and soul. And I think it's fair to say that both professions can serve as agents of healing and hope. Just a caveat here to recognize the fact that bad things do happen to people. For example, people get cancer. If someone gets cancer, it's best not to ask, who did sin, this man or his parents? Or to suggest that the reason for getting cancer was due to a lack of faith. Neither of those comments are particularly helpful. So I think it's fair to say that blame is not helpful in the realm of physical or mental health. So the question is, what is mental health? Is it possible to be mentally well if one is living with a diagnosable condition? And if one does not have a diagnosable condition, is it possible to not be mentally well? So, what about the person who does not meet criteria for a mental disorder? But the person is anxious and says, per T.S. Eliot, "Do I dare to eat a peach?" Or the person who has lost a sense of purpose or generativity, and they lament, "I grow old, I grow old." They maybe don't reach diagnostic criteria for a disorder, But are they mentally healthy? Maybe. The other area would be in terms of folks that have unhealthy attitudes and perceptions and behave badly. Again, may not meet diagnostic criteria, but we may not want to say that that person is mentally well. Okay. The World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. The Canadian Mental Health Association says that mental health means striking a balance in all aspects of your life: social, physical, spiritual, economic, and mental. Reaching a balance is a learning process. At times, you may tip the balance too much in one direction and have to find your footing again. Your personal balance will be unique, and your challenge will be to stay mentally healthy by keeping that balance. So here we find that the notion of spiritual well-being finds its way into the mix as well. In terms of spiritual needs, just a comment here that it seems as though we've grown by leaps and bounds in our understanding of the physical world, but some people believe we're sort of in the dark ages in terms of our understanding of our psychological inner world or inner well-being. I think it's fair to say that in the busyness of everyday life, it's easy for spiritual needs to fall out of balance. And maybe some of those attachments that Bryce talked about have something to do with that. Not finding a lot of time to attend to spiritual needs and well-being. Psychology Today said spirituality means something different to everyone. For some, it's about participating in organized religion, going to church, synagogue, a mosque, and so on. For others, it's more personal. Some people get in touch with their spiritual side through private prayer, yoga, meditation, quiet reflection, or even long walks. I think it's significant that Psychology Today is even commenting on this stuff to say, what is it and how does it affect us? Eugene Peterson identified two needs. He says, fundamentally, we have two needs. It's probably a little overly simplistic to boil it down to just those two needs, but I think there's an element of truth to his reflection. One is the experience of intimacy or connectedness with others, and I think Bryce highlighted that well in terms of the impact on substance abuse. And that also is the subject of a recent Harvard study. And second of all is the experience of the transcendent, or a connection with something larger than the self. And Peterson argues basically that people can meet these needs in healthy ways or in unhealthy ways. And I suppose substance could probably fall into both of those categories. You can form relationships with substance, but it's also the transcendent, something that takes us out of our everyday existence and temporarily at least, which I think we would categorized as unhealthy ways of meeting the need for transcendence. Again, from Psychology Today, research shows that even skeptics can't stifle the sense that there's something greater than the concrete world we see. As the brain processes sensory experiences, we naturally look for patterns and then seek out meaning in those patterns. The American Psychological Association currently expects therapists to take spiritual or religious issues as seriously as one would other factors such as age, gender, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. Again, this is a shift. Historically, there was this notion that if a person had problems and there was any sort of religiosity in their background, that in fact it was religiosity that accounted for their problems or their difficulties. So I think it's a fairly major shift. Not only do we not equate religiosity with psychopathology, but now we're saying you have to actually take it as seriously as you do those other factors. I think that's significant. The DSM, you'll sometimes hear people talk about the DSM. It is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It looks like this, and it's about that fat. So it's a fairly big manual. It is the standard used to categorize and define mental disorders in the field of psychology and psychiatry. Not without controversy. The newest edition came out fairly recently, within the last year, and there were some changes made, and one of them was that we categorize grief, if it lasts long enough, as clinical depression. So some people took umbrage to that categorization. So it was fairly controversial in some other areas as well. But it is the guide that is used to define what a mental disorder is in the world of psychiatry. It's produced by the American Psychiatric Association. The threshold for a diagnosis is essentially tied to, for the most part, tied to the amount of disturbance that the symptoms create. So disturbance must cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, academic, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So the question is, how do we separate feeling blue from clinical depression? And often the way we would do that is by the degree of impairment that it creates. So if a person feels blue, but they're still able to do everything that they normally do, we would probably not rate that as a major depressive disorder. However, if the person was so depressed that they can't get out of bed in the morning, that would cross the threshold, because now you can no longer go to work, it's affecting your social life, it's affecting multiple areas of your world. I think it's important to note, though, that symptoms can serve a purpose. So they can serve a purpose, they can be functional and wellness-oriented. An analogy would be a high temperature or a fever. It tells you something's wrong, and perhaps the fever itself even does something for the body to heal and to promote wellness. So it's kind of a different way of thinking about depression. I think, Wanda, you're planning to talk a little bit about depression, some of Thomas Moore's stuff this afternoon in terms of how we think about depression and some aspects to the disorder. But it can be an experience that, not always, mind you, but it can be an experience of sort of a profound introversion, which forces the person to kind of take some stock of their life, introspection, reflection. It really forces that inward turning process. So I think it's important to note symptoms aren't always bad in that regard, in that they can signal that something's wrong, and if you didn't have the symptoms, maybe you just carry on with whatever is happening in your life. The question is always, how do we think about mental illness? How does the church think about or define mental health and mental illness? So here we need to talk a little bit about stigma. Stigma is often culturally influenced, and I think the systems approach that Bryce talked about makes some sense in terms of how we think about this aspect. We lived in California for a number of years, and at points it was almost considered abnormal not to have a therapist. So people said, "What, you don't have a therapist? What's wrong with you?" In Canada, not so much. It's often seen as a sign of weakness and something that is shame-worthy. So I think there's a need to destigmatize. So how do we do that? We understand the role that culture plays. We improve communication and understanding. And sometimes with clients, I'll make the point that the Pope goes to confession. The President of the United States has, quote, spiritual advisors. And corporate executives often utilize what they call life coaches, which sometimes are actually psychologists in disguise. But we don't call them psychologists, they're traveling incognito. So for the rest of us, we're maybe in good space if we share things with the Pope and the President and so on. So let's take a look at some common types of disorders. Some of the most common are, of course, anxiety disorders, mood disorders, impulse control disorders or substance use disorders, schizophrenia and psychotic disorders, and personality disorders. So we'll touch briefly on each of those areas. just about prevalence rates. We heard some prevalence rates this morning. There's not always consensus in terms of what the prevalence rates are. The highest I've heard is Kessler, a researcher at Harvard Medical School, did a study. It's an older study now, I think maybe 2004, something like that, but said that basically half of all Americans will meet criteria for a DSM disorder sometime in their life, often starting in childhood and adolescence. So if that's true, those are high prevalence rates. And actually the umbrella is getting bigger because the DSM now each time they publish another DSM, it seems like the umbrella gets a little bit bigger. I'm going to talk just a little bit here about suicide. So one caveat, though, is it's a very necessary topic for us to talk about, but the coverage here is not sufficient. So please, if you haven't been trained, please do so. It's an important area. So we'll talk just briefly about it, but again, I want to make it clear that I'm not going to cover this topic sufficiently well. We could spend the whole day on this one, actually. But in your roles in the church, if suicidal ideation is suspected, ask about it. And remember that asking will not plant a seed. So sometimes people are worried that if I ask, you'll give them the idea. Oh, I hadn't thought about that before. Thank you very much. And now I'm suicidal. And you're going, no, I didn't want to do that. So please ask. Get help, refer to professionals. One of my supervisors said, I'm not going to be the one to lose sleep. And what she meant by that is if you don't seek help or you don't refer on, and you're laying awake in the middle of the night because you're worried that this person may do something to harm themselves, she says, I'm not going to do that. I recognize that the person who's referred on to help may lose some sleep because they might have to go to the emergency room or whatever, but I'm not going to be the one to lose sleep and worry that the person will hurt themselves. So for me, that's a pretty good benchmark. If I'm going to be laying awake worrying that the person's going to hurt themselves, probably that person should have been referred. And of course, offering support is another area. A couple comments just in terms of suicide from a church, more from a church perspective. There's this whole notion of confidentiality, and so how do we kind of deal with that? In our profession, there's sort of it's well prescribed in terms of what the exceptions are to confidentiality, and of course, danger to self is one of them. And we talk about this even with kids as well. And basically, what we say is, if safety is at risk, we need to tell whoever we need to keep people safe, basically. So, it's not uncommon for people to refuse help, so they confide in you, and then they say, but please don't tell anybody. That's probably not something that you should promise that you'll keep that one a secret. So a caveat could be, as long as no one can get hurt. But be cautious about promising to keep secrets when there is this risk. Suicidal ideation is not uncommon. If it's present, it's best to name it. Often merely naming something brings a sense of relief. It's kind of name it, tame it, so that it doesn't operate in the shadows and then cause more grief. It is not the job of church leaders to assess risk. So you're not expected to do a full risk assessment. Sometimes the argument is made, well, he or she is just seeking attention, they're doing this for some ulterior motive. And we run into this in the school board as well, and we tell teachers and administrators, it's not your job to assess risk. If somebody says they're having suicidal ideation, they need to be seen by a professional who can do a risk assessment or evaluation. Some risk, having said that, it's not your job to assess risk. Some risk factors are, just so you know what some of the factors are, and there's a much longer list. Again, I'm just highlighting some, but if there's a personal or family history of suicidal behavior, this increases risk, as does a viable plan. And usually if somebody comes in to a counseling office and they say, I have a plan, and it's a doable plan, the clinician sits up pretty fast, right, Wanda? I mean, in terms of So if somebody's got a plan, you pay attention, because that means that they've thought about it. They've thought about how they'll do it, and puts them at risk because there's an option for them to do that. And there will be factors that sort of elevate the risk, contextual factors that'll push the risk up, and there will be contextual factors that push the risk down, but we take notice if somebody has a plan. Suicidal ideation in combination with substance use or abuse increases the risk. Sometimes people who have attempted suicide say after the fact that they experience kind of a dissociative experience. I was there, but I wasn't really there. And so, which is kind of a dangerous place to be in. And of course, one of the things that substance use does is it puts us in that space where I was there, but I wasn't really there. So substance use just makes it worse. So the question is, who do we refer to? So the common kinds of referral sources would be physicians, mental health professionals, 911, and of course 24-hour crisis line options as well, depending on how serious the situation is. But I think it's necessary to at least have a plan. Make sure that there's a plan for the person to be seen and to get help. You don't have to do this yourself, but just make sure that there's a plan and somebody will follow through with it. So if it would be an adolescent or a child, you would want to contact the parents and make sure, get a commitment that they will take the child to be seen. If you're not the pastor, it would be a good idea to involve the pastor in the process. Again, this is the type of secret you don't want to keep to yourself. And this has happened in the school board where a student has made a comment to a teacher and they kept it to themselves, and then the student commits suicide. That is not pretty for the teacher, because they had that knowledge and they didn't share it. So with the risk, you want to share that knowledge. And then just one final note, that at times, despite our best efforts, people do in fact commit suicide. And many clinicians have had this happen. And so one of my supervisors had it happen. She had her, the patient was committed to a hospital, was put on, I think, a 20-minute watch. And in between the 20 minutes, the gentleman committed suicide. It just about drove her from the profession. But she got some good support and so on. I mean, what more can you do than that? She had the person hospitalized, they were put on a watch, and it still happened. So I think the note here is that the takeaway from this is, despite our best efforts, sometimes it still happens. Let's look at some common symptoms of anxiety. I guess that's an appropriate thing to follow up suicide with anxiety, because it tends to evoke those feelings. So what are some symptoms of anxiety? There are things like feelings of panic, fear, uneasiness, problems sleeping, cold and sweaty hands or feet, shortness of breath, heart palpitations, an inability to be still or calm, dry mouth, numbness or tingling in hands and feet. So those are some common symptoms that people experience when they're having anxiety. Turning the page, we have common symptoms associated with depression. I realize I'm going through this fairly quickly, but I just want to sort of highlight some of these symptoms, and then we can talk about some resources and so on afterwards. Some common symptoms of depression are feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, loss of interest in daily activities. We call that anhedonia, which essentially means a person no longer finds interest in things that they normally find pleasurable. So if a person loves tennis and you know they're depressed and you say, let's go play tennis, and they say, I'm not interested, that's significant, because they've lost interest in things that they normally like to do. Appetite or weight changes. This can be either up or down. Sleep changes, same thing there. It can be too much sleep, not enough sleep. Anger and irritability. We have to find this with children and adolescents, that irritability tends to be a factor. Children and adolescents tend not to have that same lethargy that adults have. It can almost look more like an agitated ADHD almost. They're agitated. And of course the irritability, I think, comes from the fact that they don't feel well on the inside. So our tolerance for things is just really, really low. So So that's one thing that we should look for with children and adolescents. The other would be somatic complaints, headaches, stomach aches, that kind of thing, and social withdrawal. Those are things that are a little bit different in younger folks than with adults. So continuing on with our list, or our general list here: loss of energy, self-loathing, sometimes reckless behavior, concentration problems, and again, unexplained aches and pains. Does that kind of fit with people's understanding? Okay. Let's take a look at some of the psychotic disorders. Schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. They're fundamentally characterized by difficulty with reality testing. And sometimes unwanted sensory experiences, so hearing voices and that sort of thing. And of course, in the school, it's always, everybody says, well, is this kid psychotic? They're talking to their imaginary friend, and they're having these lengthy conversations, and there's no one there. I think they're psychotic. And we sort of say, well, let's take a step back from that. And take note of the fact that whether it's kind of consistent with who the person thinks they are, or whether it feels like the sensory experiences are coming at them from outside. And so if it feels like sensory experiences are coming to you from outside yourself, then you might do things to try and make it go away. Cover your ears or do things to try and make it stop. Those types of experiences would not be classified as consistent with your sense of self, because it feels like it's happening to you, or it's telling you to do things that you would not normally do. The symptoms associated with the psychotic disorders can include hallucinations. So that again would be, you could have visual or auditory hallucinations, delusions where there actually is a stimulus there, but it's misinterpreted. There's a sense that the voice on the radio is talking directly to you, or that the people on the TV can actually see you, or so on. Disorganized speech, disorganized or catatonic behavior, absent emotions, emotional flatness, apathy, or lack of speech. So those are some things that are characteristic of psychotic disorders, but psychotic disorders are tricky, and even psychiatrists at points have a hard time sort of sorting out psychosis. At other times it's not an issue. It's very obvious, but there are times when it's uncertain. And of course, substance use exacerbates those problems. In fact, there's research now on use of marijuana, I believe, right? Is that right, BRICE, in adolescence and onset of schizophrenia? So maybe it isn't a causal relationship. I'm not sure what the mechanism is there, but for sure substance use can trigger these things. Common sort of breakpoints for this stuff to emerge are sort of in the adolescence, sort of 12, 13, 14, and then again at sort of 18, 19, 20. And if you think about it, those tend to be common stress points. So if there's an underlying predisposition to some of this stuff, and then these other things happen, it can manifest itself in a psychotic disorder at that time. Okay. Personality disorders. This one is characterized by poor or conflictual relationships. It's the hallmark, and there are many different types of personality disorders. For some of the disorders, we can see things like impulsive or risky behaviors, unstable or fragile self-image, unstable or intense relationships, mood swings, often in reaction to interpersonal stress. So the mood goes up and down, but it goes up and down depending on what's happening interpersonally. And at times, suicidal behavior or threats of self-injury. So again, there are many different types of personality disorders, but this gives you a bit of an overview generally of some of the things that we look for. Often these disorders are not diagnosed. So it's an underdiagnosed category, and sometimes doesn't receive a lot of attention. But it's still in the DSM. They've tweaked it a little bit. It's still there, but again, often they're undiagnosed. Undetected personality disordered individuals can wreak havoc on a congregation. I remember Marcus Smucker at AMBS telling a story about how he was a pastor, I think, at a church in Oregon, and there was a congregant there who really did, in fact, wreak havoc on the congregation. He said, had I known, and Marcus went on and did training in psychotherapy and spiritual disciplines and so on, and he said, had I known then what I know now, we would have handled that situation very differently. And I think some of the things he was talking about were, for example, phone calls in the middle of the night and just really no boundaries. And the church took a supportive role, thinking that if they just, gave more support to the individual, that would fix the problem. And it didn't. It just continued on. And so I think it's important for church leaders to be kind of aware of some of these things. Often individuals that have a personality disorder don't have strong internal controls, so boundaries often are an issue, and therefore they need external supports and controls. And a lot of the therapy that is geared to dealing with personality disordered individuals has to do with those strong external supports and controls and really accountability, but it's tough work, right? Because we think of these things as being fairly set in personality. So we typically would not diagnose a personality disorder prior to 18 years of age. So we're talking about, the formative years have already happened. So it's difficult work for sure. For such individuals, logical appeals sometimes don't seem to work. So you can try to reason with the person and say, it's best not to call the pastor at 3 a.m, but that doesn't always kind of connect. They don't always grab that. So I think it's fair to say that action needs to be taken in terms of boundary setting and confronting some of these problems, not allowing the person to get away with it. And typically pastors, often I think you bear the brunt of this stuff because they make good targets for whatever reason, whether they're authority figures or whatever. But it is within our power to say, you can't treat the pastor that way, essentially. Or just as a caveat here, though, many individuals who are confronted about this stuff often don't take kindly to it. So sometimes you get some resistance that you get pushback. So. Psychological symptoms of abuse, I think Bryce covered that very well. So that was an easy slide for me to do, Bryce. I just said, see Bryce. So it's wonderful. What do we do if we suspect that someone has a mental disorder? Typically, we would refer to a mental health professional or to a physician. In the process of referrals, there are some ethical considerations that I think should be made. Things like patient rights, confidentiality, which we talked a little bit about, informed consent, professional responsibilities and liabilities. I remember Eric Sawatsky talking about this again at AMBS in a pastoral care course. The liability, if you're treating somebody and things go south, then what's the liability that falls on the professional? Dual relationships. When I talked about this with Bryce, he said, I forget your exact comment, but many dual relationships, right, Bryce, was your comment in the church. Because if you're counseling somebody and then you see them on Sunday morning and then you see them in the foyer and then you see them at the church picnic and then you make a comment about something fairly innocuous, and how does the person interpret that? Is he making and so it's pastors have in many respects a very unique and difficult job, I think. A very important one, but a very difficult one, just because there are many of these dual relationships that are in existence. Whereas most clinicians don't have that. The patient shows up at your office, you have your time with the patient, and then they leave, and you don't typically see them until they come back. Although that's not always true, but there's more structure inherent in that model than there is in the pastoral model. The issue again around professional competence and training. So to be aware of what those limits are, and I think the numbers that you talked about, Bryce, were the numbers that I was hearing from Eric Sawatsky years ago at AMBS, so sort of 2 to 3 sessions kind of thing, And the argument there, I think, was if it takes more than that, it's probably best to refer. If you're doing too much stuff in terms of the counseling world, who's doing the rest of the work of the church or the pastor, and then all these other issues can come into play as well. Conflicting values, mind you, that can happen with a therapist as well, but it's something to keep in mind. So how do we promote understanding? I think we work to promote empathy and understanding, so I think that's an important job, how we frame things. A comment is that it's often very difficult for people in the congregation when they see others that need help and they don't get help. That can be a very difficult and very painful situation. Sometimes the services just aren't available to the individual. Sometimes the individual refuses. So there's many different reasons why an individual may not get the help they need, but it can be very painful. We need to recognize the limits of our ability to help others. I think this grows more difficult the closer the person is to us. So it's understanding our limitations. Early on in my training, I was working at a children's outpatient mental health clinic, and when clients would do well, I would get really excited and giddy and all enthusiastic. And when the client would not do well, I'd sort of get sad and depressed. And one day my supervisor came in and put a white chess piece on my desk, and she said to me, "I want you to have this." I was like, okay. Well, essentially she was telling me, don't be the white knight. Don't live and die on the basis of how your clients do. You're not that powerful. So I think that it's important to recognize that we fill important roles, but there are limitations to our ability to help others. And certainly if we're in the business of trying to control and exercise power over others, it's probably a recipe for frustration. And pastors, I think, could attest to that. If you're uncertain whether to refer, here are some things you can do. Consult with a knowledgeable colleague. Again, if you're not the pastor, probably best to confer with the pastor. Again, consider the degree of impairment. If you think that this is more than a 2 to 3 counseling session issue. And the last one is if the thought occurs to refer. I don't know how many people have ever gone sailing, but if you're sailing and you see storm clouds on the horizon and the thought occurs to you, I wonder if I should put the sails down. You probably should put the sails down. The same is true here, I think. If the thought occurs to you, I wonder if I should be referring this person, probably if you have that thought, it's probably the case that you should put the sails down. Who do we refer to? Therapists, counselors. I like therapists and counselors because I think that they have a good sense. They can take a sort of a holistic, a systems approach. They can involve the family if needed. They can assess whether they think it's indicated that a referral be made to a physician for medication. So I think, my bias, of course, is toward therapists and counselors. Agencies like Shalom, of course. There are private practitioners, clinical social workers, psychologists in the community as well, physicians, psychiatrists. Do folks understand the distinction between a psychiatrist and a psychologist? Is that kind of clear? Basically, a psychiatrist is a medical doctor who goes on and gets training in psychiatry. A psychologist is not. So we don't have the medical training, can't prescribe medications. So it tends to be the case that psychiatrists do more of the, in the old days, I think they did more of both. They prescribed medication and did therapy. I think now most psychiatrists are pretty much just writing scripts. Would that be your understanding too, Wanda? Yeah. Just because they're in such short demand, and it's rare, I think, that the psychiatrist does both. And of course, emergency services, again, 911, emergency rooms, 24-hour crisis lines. Sometimes the fast track to psychiatry is through the emergency room door. So you go there presenting with a psychiatric issue. You will probably, under most circumstances, be seen by somebody in that field, but the wait times are high. But emergency services, depending again on the severity of the situation. Psychotropic medication, that was one of the questions that was asked about. This one's a complicated one, and we get asked a lot about it with respect to children who have ADHD. And usually my response is, with respect to psychotropic medications, let's not be hyperactive in running to medication, but let's also not be hyperactive in saying, no way, never, not going to happen. It's a difficult one. I think that the role that medication can play, it can kind of stop the runaway train. If somebody's so severely depressed that they can't get out of bed in the morning, it's really difficult to get doing the stuff that you need to do to get better if you can't get out of bed in the morning. So it can kind of put you in a position where you can get your feet under you and you can do whatever is necessary. So this one's a bit of a tough one, and it's really, I think, needs some assessment on a case-by-case basis. And so it's hard to make sort of general sweeping statements around this piece. Often with kids who have ADHD, what I recommend is, well, let's try some other stuff first. And if it works, wonderful. And if it doesn't, then let's ask that question. So again, don't write it off, but it doesn't necessarily, in many cases, it doesn't necessarily have to be the first stop on the journey. Because my concern would be, if it is the first stop in the journey, how do you know that other stuff wouldn't have worked, or you don't have that peace of mind of knowing that, we did try other stuff and it just didn't work, and so that then we needed to go the medication route. Research is pretty clear that the best outcomes are when medication is combined with therapy. And there's been a lot of studies in this domain. Some studies sort of equate the two if they're independent. Medication therapy is as effective as medication. But I think that clearly the combination of the two is better than just medication alone. The other piece is just an important kind of caveat here, is that if you're referring for psychotropic medication, then you're looking at a physician referral or a psychiatrist or a pediatrician, and they can rule out medical problems as well. And so, for example, the thyroid problems can mimic symptoms of depression. So we look kind of silly for treating somebody for depression when it turns out the problem is with their thyroid. On the other hand, there are many people that are being treated medically for things that have a psychosomatic origin as well. So that problem can cut both ways. But generally we say, have you been to your doctor? Have you had a physical, blood work, and so on? It's usually good to make sure that there are no medical issues that are underlying the problem. And again, there's a relationship between our body and mind as well, but it's something that gets overlooked sometimes. So, how are we doing for time? We're about 1:45, so we've got some time. So, okay. Maybe, I don't know, shall I open up for, do we want questions? Would that make sense? And then divvy up into the groups and do some of the discussions about the role, or what makes the discussion group? Okay. So we'll do that, and then, okay. So we've got some questions on the board. How do we respond to mental health issues? How do we walk with family members? What are the obstacles? What role can pastors and church leaders play? How can we work at reducing stigma? And how can congregations as a whole support health initiatives? And so there are some creative things that some congregations are doing. When we were in the States, there was a program where the financial responsibility was shared, essentially a third. So the patient paid a third of the cost of the therapy, the church subsidized a third, and the therapist discounted their fee by a third. So it was kind of a third, which I thought was kind of creative. And of course, got to get a plug-in for Shalom here, because the model of Shalom is to provide services for individuals that cannot afford the services. So, and a lot of people cannot afford $135, $140, or $150 per hour. And if you don't have coverage through your benefit plan, that's expensive. So the question is, how does the church support that? And one of the beautiful ways that the church does that is supporting Shalom, because that's in large part the work that Shalom does. So, Make sense? Okay. So why don't we do people want to stand again? Does that make sense? Stand again and kind of do what you did in your other groups, and let's tackle some of these questions.
As someone who lives with a mood disorder, one is around medication. It's really hard to be someone who uses medication for a mood disorder. And I think it's really important to let people know that a number that they shared with me at home was really revolutionary in my thinking was that medication can only deal with 25% of an illness. I thought as soon as they got the mixture right, my life was going to be awesome. And when the mixture finally was right, I thought it was going to stay awesome. Yeah. So, and the flip side of taking medication, and you see it every time you see a commercial in a magazine or on the news, I love it. They go through all the possible side effects. Honestly, it takes a lot of courage to do the medication thing, and you have all kinds of side effects that are almost as bad as the illness itself. So I felt a bit of a bias against medication, and mental illness can be a medical problem, and it can require medication, and it's extremely expensive. And there was a period in my life where I was waiting for Trillium benefits for almost a year, and medication was $500 a month, and I used up my medical leave, and my church provided money directly to my pharmacist to cover my medication. So that's one. And I guess the other piece that I wanted to share is, what was it? I guess it was just creating a safe space. And creating a safe space for people to speak honestly and openly about what's happening in their lives. And that doesn't happen overnight. It's particularly hard. It's as hard in a large congregation as it is in a small one. In a large one, forming small groups where safety and relationships can evolve is great. In a small church where safety and relationships are there, it can be really hard to open up. So I'm hearing people speaking on both levels, and I guess I just want to say that it can be really hard in either situation. It's a really hard topic, but one definitely worth having dialogue about.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good comments. The numbers I've heard in terms of antidepressants are sort of a third. For a third of people, it works really well. For a third, works somewhat, and for a third, it doesn't work. And so there's a lot of variability in terms of how these medications work. There's been a lot of advances in terms of psychotropic medication. In the old days, it had a fairly global, or could have a fairly global effect in terms of side effects. It could affect the way a person walked, for example. Now the medications target more specifically certain neurotransmitters in the brain. And for a while there was kind of a push to suggest maybe the whole world should be on Prozac. We'd all be happier, healthier, wealthier, and so few side effects that why not? So we've come a long way in terms of psychotropic medications, but they're still new in the context of human history. It's the last nanosecond that we've had them, so we're still a lot to be discovered, and it's a big question for sure.
I would label myself as a consumer survivor, and one of the things I'd like to ask you to comment on is the recovery model and strengths-based approach to mental health. And just from my own experience in recovery, that I now work with the Canadian Mental Health Association, and one of my main qualifications is lived experience. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, got a t-shirt for that, and lived through it and recovered enough to come back to work. And I'm not trying to be automatically opposed to medication. I've gone through medication, but also looking at recovery and all the therapy that's out there, including agencies that
First of all, most of us are working really hard at strength-based resilience models of that sort. There's always the danger is you can't help somebody unless you've been there. And the danger on the opposite side is the person who's been there does countertransference. He assumed or she assumes that everybody has the illness like you had the illness. So you've got to have supervision. I think we need to create safe space. And in terms of both of you, one of my concerns would be that we as ministers, as well as elders and deacons, may try to figure out how we could form either a support group around the person or with the person, or how the church could be safe. The whole church probably won't be safe. And so where is it that we put together some people that could walk with you? Elders and deacons and ministers don't have to do all the work. It's just as good for a couple of people from the congregation to walk alongside. The other thing I want to say, partly because Elsie Millard is here as well, please think about parish nurses. Parish nurses are a wonderful mix between those of us who are ministers and those who have had health and anatomy training and all that kind of stuff. Parish nurses are wonderful. I often said if I were going into the ministry again, and I'm beyond doing that, I think, other than on a part-time basis, I would love to have a parish nurse working with me. Parish nurses see the physiology, I see the spirituality. Parish nurses look at the anatomy, I look at the group dynamics, the emotionality. It's not that parish nurses don't look at that as well. And it's amazing what parish nurses can see in people's eyes and faces. And so I think in this whole area we're talking about, whether it's addiction or mental health, I would really highly recommend parish nurses to complement those of us who are ministers so that we see the whole person, and then we try to figure out how in the congregation can we create a safe space, at least for like 4 or 5 people around the person who's struggling or the family who's struggling, so that that family can actually have a place where if things come up, they have a place to vent and then get back on the task again. I think those are really important things.
Where do we go if it's our pastor who is displaying symptoms or characteristics of something that is way beyond what they would normally be doing? Where do we go if it's our pastor? How can we support them?
Mennonite Church, Eastern Canada. Right there he is.
The pastor's pastor.
We've got several people on staff at MCEC, and they can help us to move forward on it. But I think it's important, this was not a Mennonite congregation, but my children, one of my children and my grandchildren were at a church where the pastor wasn't functioning very well, and there's a real hesitance to confront a pastor. But I think you need to say something to MCEC and say, what can we do here?
Thanks, Bryce. So who's going to pastor this pastor?
I'll talk with you, Henry.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I have a feeling I need a psychologist. The Canadian Mental Health Association took into consideration physical, mental, spiritual, economic, social. Didn't say emotional. So can I assume that if I have balance or growth in all of those areas, that I'm okay? And then my next part would be, okay, so let's say I'm okay. I'm balanced in all those areas. And I go to church and I pray the Lord's Prayer and it says, relieve me from temptation. Right? But I leave church and I want alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling, and I fail every time. Does that qualify me?
Bryce, that sounds like a good question for you. So.
Why didn't you have other issues other than sex and alcohol? Chocolate chip cookie.
That one we can treat. That one we can treat.
I think what you need to do is, as you feel, or hopefully as people start to feel the kind of struggle that you feel, who is there in the church you can actually talk to? How can you actually put it out there? How can you actually see, I'm struggling with this, please, can we go and have a cup of coffee, or maybe can, another person who's had issues in the congregation and yourself and the minister or a parish nurse or somebody else have this conversation. The main thing you don't want to do is you don't want to isolate. You don't want the person to isolate, and you don't want there to be isolation in the congregation. So what we need to do is we need to talk about these things. And I think as we talk about these things, we find out that all of us, can walk with you. Not all of us, but many of us can walk with you, and we're not going to condemn you. And then as we walk along, you're going to get better.
There will be lots of time for conversation this afternoon. Okay, so a few people who had already lined up with their questions, I assured them of that, and the rest of you want to indicate that as well. So thank you again for your presentation, David and Bryce, for engaging this conversation now. We'll pick it up again this afternoon.